the numbers of days paid leave. Thank you.
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And it's not often I get to up in the House here and praise the government for a piece of legislation. And in part two here, I have to acknowledge that it is making real progress, in spite of in part one not including, as of right, worker representation on the Board of WorkSafe New Zealand. We have provisions in here that ensure workers are able to contribute to workplace health and safety, and that's good. But let's not get all teary-eyed about this and think that the government's moved on. And it's all for workers, because it's got in page 36 actually 19ZH and later in 19ZJ a perfect balance. One that protects the employer's right to instruct workers to go and work elsewhere if a part of a mine or part of a workplace was shut down for health and safety reasons, so they can instruct them to go and work somewhere else, presuming, of course, that they've got the skills and the health and safety training. But then, of course, they have rightfully, which is why I'm saying it's balanced, included protection there of site health and safety representatives in performing their functions and powers. I speak from some experience, having been a shift delegate in a mine in West Australia. I was responsible for shutting down the mine when it was too unsafe. When dust got to a point where we could not safely operate, then I had to stop operations. It's not an easy job for any individual to stop operations, to intervene and say this is unsafe, we should stop work. There's huge pressure, not just from the employer or the foreman or the leading hand, but also from fellow workers who, particularly if they're on a bonus system, say, oh, come on, let's get on with it. Look, it's okay, we'll get on, you know, it's not that unsafe. The pressure comes from everywhere, on the individual, the site representative, who is going to make a judgment on health and safety issues. And so this provision in here does provide some protection from senior executives or from anything that might happen. But you can't actually legislate for what is peer pressure in such a workplace. That is why it is important to have very clear codes of practices and regulations, of course, supporting them. That's where the 1992 legislation fell down, of course. Promises of a code of practice, oh yes, and nothing eventuated. So we have, as I say, a balanced piece of legislation in part two, protecting both the employer to instruct the workers to get on and do something else if they think something's unsafe, but also for the worker in intervening to point out a danger and stop work or stop operations that they are not unfairly or unduly discriminated against or penalised in any way. And moving on to the issue of inspectors, Mr. Chairman, as I said before, the harsh reality of what we have learnt from Pike River, I have to say, a Freudian slip, perhaps another terrible disaster in my West Coast region, where government had some responsibility. At Pike River, we had, as I say, at the time of the disaster, 2 mine inspectors. We have 3 now. Now, I think any fair-minded New Zealander would say that that's not huge progress. Oh, 4, oh, sorry, there's 3, and there's the Chief Inspector, of course, who's basically tied to the office. Yeah, sorry, the Minister did correct me. 1 Chief Inspector, 3 inspectors. And so while that person is tied up rightfully with the development of regulations, of codes, with a huge amount of paperwork that was quite frankly inadequate 2 or 3 years ago, and I have to say the person they have appointed is first class, absolutely first class, and I know he will follow through on all the recommendations of the Royal Commission if he is given a chance. He will also implement a very robust mines inspectorate if given a chance. But he hasn't been given the resources. And I think that while he, I know, is too professional to go out and criticise, because he is a loyal public servant, Mr Chairman,
Damien O'Connor.
in the true tradition of public servant, that he knows his responsibility and he will carry it out. If he doesn't have the resources, he too is going to be hamstrung, just as the two inspectors at the time of the Pike River tragedy were hamstrung. They were totally frustrated. Mr Speaker, if I go into 41A here, inspectors may issue a prohibition notice in relation to a mining operation. That is, that if they believe it's unsafe, they can issue a notice. And indeed, some say, why didn't it happen to Pike River? In fact, some say, why didn't it happen to Spring Creek? I don't think we should forget about the reality that the government's own state-owned enterprise was operating an underground mine not too far from Pike River as the crow flies. That was shut down for 6 months after the Pike River tragedy. 6 months without a tonne of coal being brought out, because the inspectorate had not been able to instruct that mine to maintain the standards that were needed for health and safety. The question I have of all of this is, if the inspectorate does not carry through with its duties, if it's unable to do so, who then is accountable for any failure? And I have to say that today, we ask the government why they are not owning up to accountability in some form. It might be token, in fact, given the terrible loss of life, for the mistakes that were made through government's own agencies, the Department of Labour. And we have today asked why the government has not considered it a fair and moral action to pay the families something in recognition of government failure and in recognition of their loss. So in setting up the inspectorate in Part 2, in providing them and reinforcing them with the ability to close a mine if something is deemed unsafe, should they fail to do so in the future, and God help, I hope they never are in that situation again, who then should be held accountable for that? And the Minister, dare I say, should be, if he or she does not find the resources to run a proper mines inspectorate. That was the case. We've got a reasonable expectation from families right now that someone or a government on behalf of people should be held account, and that perhaps a payment to them, not as any compensation, no one can compensate them for the loss, but as payment and recognition of responsibility, then I think the very least that could happen is that the government should front up with that. Mr Chairman, I know we're not talking about that in Part 2, but we must ask the questions that in implementing regulations and passing legislation, if it's failed to be carried through with the intent that we have passed it, then who should pay a penalty or who should be held accountable for that? And I have to say, we've seen none of that so far, from the terrible failures at Pike River, from the well-documented failures, the Minister did resign, I accept that. Yes, the Minister resigned, and the Ministers have apologised. But accountability goes beyond that, Minister. And that Minister hasn't been accountable for anything. Mr Chairman, going back to the bill here, the Minister did tempt me, Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman. Can I say that in passing the legislation, if the Minister bothered to read it, she would see that we are passing over to inspectors obligations and powers that we expect to be carried through. And if they're not carried through, if they don't do the job that we know is needed, then who should be held to account? And if the resources haven't been provided from governments, then government should be held to account. And if there's tragic loss of life, What should we say? What should we do for those families? I say we should make a payment to them, and that minister should front up and support that, given that she's one of the front bench that have so far ignored that reasonable expectation.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's